And welcome back to another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports Podcast where I, Richard Harris Jr., talk about why I prefer the sports of today to yesterday, or yesterday's sports to today. See, I was drinking water and I lost my train of thought. Today's topic is kind of an open-ended one. Can't really put a name to it. But basically, I'm going to talk to you today about statistics and one of the reasons why I prefer the statistics of the 80s and 90s to today. See, the one thing that we never did as kids, statisticians, historians, people who have knowledge of sport, is we never threw in the face of the people who came before us. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Today, they like to throw in our faces the accomplishments of today's athletes because a lot of people like myself don't really give it credibility or credence because they get more opportunities today to do the things that others didn't. For example, let's talk basketball. In the 80s, 90s, the playoff series were 2 out of 3. Sometimes next was 3 out of 5, and then 1 4 out of 7 series, and then the championship. And there's so many different ways you can analyze that in the regards of numbers. Because if your team was good, you didn't play in the 2 out of 3 series because you got a bye. And so even today, if your team is good, you get a bye out of the first round. And so that's similar. But they didn't play that many series. Today, they play, you got to qualify to get in. This is new, by the way. Got to qualify to get in if you're one of the lower seeds. Then you got to play 4 out of 7. Then you play another 4 out of 7. Then you play another 4 out of 7. And then you play for the championship. And so statistics are skewed in basketball because you get more opportunities to create them because you got more games to play. Regular season statistics have stayed the same because it's 82 and 82. Baseball's doing this as well. In baseball, in the 60s and the 70s, there wasn't all these different playoff games, and it was best record in the East, best record in the West. They met. World Series was the champion of the East, champion of the National League, champion of the American League. That's it. And no one from my generation would criticize what happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s because that's the way it was. As opposed to today, where the networks throw in our faces, he is the most this, she is the most that. And you're like, dude, they're playing more games. So why is that an important statistic? Last night, watching the baseball, Jose Altuve, who I talked about earlier this week, moved up to second all-time in home runs in the postseason. Jose Altuve is 5'7", 150 pounds soaking wet. And he clearly is the most polarizing figure in baseball of this generation because a part of you wants to like him and a part of you remembers he was part of a team that is accused of cheating And every time he goes to a road park, he gets booed lustily because people remember the the scandal that said that the Houston Astros cheated to beat the Dodgers in the World Series. I don't call it cheating because if somebody can figure out the signals and give you signals to help you, that's part of the game. In NASCAR, they say if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. When they're trying to enhance certain things to make the car go faster, as long as it don't kill nobody. And I look at the same way in every sport. I hear people talk about how players know exactly what the call is on teams in the NBA, meaning like they'll come over the half court and they'll do thumbs down or four up or three, whatever, and the opposing team knows exactly what it is because they've seen it so much and they call it out. No one complains about that. In football, teams put up posters of their plays, but they put it in terms of symbols. So you try to figure out what symbols mean. But all you gotta do is know down and distance and figure out exactly what they're gonna run, but just react and make the play. But if you're smart enough to catch it, figure it out, God bless you. But Altuve has played in a ton of games. And that always cracks me up when it comes to statistics in sports because I look at a team like the Atlanta Braves of the 90s and the 2000s. The Braves won all those division titles and they're in the playoffs every year. So you have to assume that Chipper, that Terry Pendleton, that Maddox, Smoltz, and Glavine have unbelievable stats. John Smoltz, I believe, was 14-2 as a pitcher in the postseason. He surpassed Whitey Ford, who had like a very meager 10-8 record in postseason because they didn't have as many games. Whitey Ford probably would have put that record out of reach because the Yankees were always playing for championships. And so the Braves, but the Braves didn't always get to the World Series. And I find it funny that they make such a big deal about all these statistics today and not throw in the fact of the games played. And so I don't understand why they don't do that. And so that's one of the reasons why I prefer the 80s and 90s sports. Because the statistics weren't important. The statistics didn't define the players. You just knew who the players were. I remember I met Michael Wilbon in a nightclub one time. And it was right after I did Sports Geniuses, so I was like up on all the statistics. And we started to have a little bit of a conversation. And I said, who do you think is the all-time record holder for average points a game in a NBA Finals series? 4 games or less, 5 games or less. And of course, the first answer anyone always will say is Jordan, and Jordan is right. And it was against Phoenix. I mean, he absolutely killed Phoenix because they had no one to guard him. And I laugh at that because I remember meeting somebody or reading something recently or watching NBA Today, and they were criticizing Dan Marley because Dan Marley, I guess, I don't know, to people today wasn't a good player. But if Dan Marley played today, he would be a superstar because he was a shooter. He could make the threes. He drove to the basket. He played defense, which they don't do today. He'd make every team and start every team to play. So I think it was Kendrick Perkins who kind of was trying to clown him. But Dan Marley would give you numbers. Dan Marley made the Olympic team. And granted, they lost. Kendrick Perkins didn't make no Olympic team. I digress. But my point simply is you just knew and know who the people are, the reasons are why they did what they did. I mean, Jordan killed people in the playoffs, and he had high scoring averages. And they don't bring it up because there's not a need to. But today there's a need to try to bolster arguments that are foolish. And I continue to get bombarded with these texts, emails on my Facebook page about LeBron and Michael. And of course, the recent ones are Altuve and Jeter. Jeter's not a home run hitter. Jeter was an average hitter who hit home runs. Altuve is not a home run hitter. He's an average hitter that hits home runs too. And they are, yes, the faces of their teams. But they had different approaches. If Jeter hit a home run, it was more than likely, I don't want to say luck, but it was more than likely unexpected. Altuve hits a home run, you're not shocked because that's what he does. When he's healthy, when he's right, he comes up and he's the first batter of the game, you're kind of nervous. And we're also learning that statistics today don't mean spit because there are players who stink during the regular season, but in the postseason are superstars. As opposed to back in the day, the superstars was the superstars year round. And that still happens to some extent today, but it's the players who are more shocking. Let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say in English. In the 80s, 70s, 90s, World Series were won by players who you never would expect. A player like Jeff Treadway had good World Series for the Braves. Even though Dave Justice was the MVP of the World Series, Treadway kept getting hits. Brian Doyle for the Yankees in 78. Brian Doyle was backup infielder, got the job because Willie Randolph got hurt, and he and Bucky Dent, they couldn't get out. Scott Brosius, he was the number 9 hitter for the Yankees in the 90s, and Brosius just kept getting hits, making plays. And if I think about the NBA in terms of the championships, it was always the best players that made the play, and he was also the best player in the regular season. I mean, Cornbread Maxwell had a great series in 81 for the Celtics, but, you know, most of the time it was Larry Bird leading the way. I mean, and ML Carr had his little run, but again, it was Larry Bird leading the way. Magic Johnson leading the way. Moses and Doc leading the way in the 80s. In the 90s, all 6 of Jordan's championships, he was the MVP. But, you know, Hansen had a game against Utah that brought them back when they were down 17 one night. Today, it's like the players don't care about the regular season. They get to the postseason, and they are a different man. Bryce Harper didn't have a good year this year in baseball. But in the postseason, he's hitting the ball 6,000 miles every time he bats. Kyle Schwarber had a year this year in baseball where he hit 46 home runs and he batted barely 230. He didn't even hit 230. He gets in the postseason and he's hitting home runs and getting big hits all the time. And he's been doing that his entire career, from his days with the Cubs to the Nationals. He likes facing the best pitchers because the best pitchers throw strikes, so he takes advantage of it. And I find that hilarious because in a lot of ways you expect them to do that as opposed to you didn't expect. Brian Doyle, Scott Brocious. I mean, Ozzie Smith was never a great hitter. He was known for his defense, but in the World Series, in the postseason, he got clutch hits. I mean, Edgar Renteria killed the Yankees in the 2003 World Series, the Josh Beckett World Series. They just kept getting hits. All these guys who were good players just kept getting hits. I'm totally drawing a blank on the second baseman for the Marlins that series that just hit the home run in one of the games late and beat the Yankees. The Red Sox, when they won the World Series in 2017, they had players that never heard of hit home runs, multiple home runs in the game. I mean, Mookie had a big series. He was the star. But that team had several players who you never heard of perform. And so you say, what's my point? My point is somebody like Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler's a superstar. Not because of the regular season, but because in the postseason, he's killing people. They're saying Jimmy Butler's a Hall of Famer. Jimmy Butler has done nothing in the regular season to put him in the Hall of Fame. But in the postseason, who's been better than Jimmy Butler in the last 5 years, other than Steph? Obviously, Anthony Davis beat them a few years ago, but nobody saw that coming. I mean, there's this supposed funny story about Jimmy Butler. He didn't want to practice when he was in Minnesota with a group of, I guess they had like 2 teams, and so he didn't want to play with a particular team in practice and kind of didn't do anything in practice and was upset, whatever, and finally came out and was like, all right, fine. You want me to play? I'll play. And he absolutely destroyed the other team. It was the starters. And then walked off the court. And it was like, when Jimmy wants to play, Jimmy can play. And that's, I guess, how he is in the postseason. When Jimmy wants to dominate, he'll dominate. He don't want to put all that energy in during the regular season, dominate, set up the home court advantages or anything like that. He wants to wait till the postseason and be the star of the postseason. And in a lot of ways, that's what Bryce Harper did this year. Bryce Harper sat back and watched Turner and Real Muto and Castellanos have a good year. But now we're in the postseason, and he's turning into a Mr. October. As opposed to the 80s and 90s, the star was the star throughout. Dominique was Dominique in the regular season, Dominique in the postseason. Tom Chambers was Tom Chambers in the regular season. Tom Chambers was Tom Chambers in the postseason. Patrick Ewing. Ewing was dominant in the regular season, dominant in the postseason. And so that's why these games are so unpredictable today because you never know who's going to be the star. And then you look at the teams who've been knocked out in the playoffs today, the Dodgers and the Braves. Best records, Orioles, best records during the season. Faced teams that had players who loved this moment. Corey Seager, World Series MVP from a few years ago. Stepped up his game in the postseason. The Phillies beat the Braves 2 years in a row now. Two teams that the Braves had that have been unbelievable. You look at hockey. Steven Stamkos during the regular season, Tampa Bay Lightning during the regular season, they play hard. They play, a little edge. Get to the postseason, they're a totally different team. They kick everybody's butt. Was it 3 straight Stanley Cup final appearances? 2 of them didn't win last year. I guess what I'm saying is I appreciate the consistency of the 80s and 90s as opposed to guys just showing up in the postseason. And obviously you play to win the championship. I want to see from start to finish. I want to see the dominance from the start to the finish. I want to see Bryce Harper hit 57 home runs in the regular season, hit 149 runs batted in, then get to the postseason and keep it going. That rarely happens. In fact, it almost never happens where a guy is so dominant during the regular season that he's dominant in the postseason. Oral Hershiser was in the 80s when he had that streak of 57 straight innings without giving up a run. And in the postseason, he was just as lights out. Very, 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 very rarely. Justin Verlander, he stinks in the postseason. His World Series record is very bad. He just got his first win last year. Look at Mad Max. Mad Max dominates in the regular season, gets to the postseason, arm is tired, this injury. He's hittable in the postseason. Look at the Atlanta Braves. The Atlanta Braves in the 90s. Regular season, pitching was their calling card. They outpitched you. The bullpen did their thing. They were just extraordinary in the regular season. And then they get to the postseason when the matchups are the best against the best. And they're supposed to be the best. And they win one championship in that 14-year run. That's what makes GOATs special. That's what makes Hall of Famers special. Because from day 1 to day 201, they are the best. Last night I was watching the WNBA final, and the New York Liberties, Breanna Stewart, was voted league MVP, which everybody thinks was a misprint because A'ja Wilson should have been MVP because not only was she the best defensive player, most unstoppable player, her team had the best record in the league. And the only reason why Breanna Stewart got MVP, in my opinion, is because the Liberty beat them, the Aces, 3 out of 5. Had the Aces won 3 out of 5, Wilson is the MVP, period. Wilson has been quiet in the postseason. She hasn't really needed to dominate because the team is loaded, but she dominates when she can, and she dominates when it's necessary. And last night, she did. And they won the championship. Even though New York did have a lead, they blew the lead. Stewart had the ball with a chance to hit the game-winning shot, and she LeBron'd. She passed. Mike would have shot. Diana Taurasi would have shot. Forced the referees to make a call. But again, they had a player come off the bench who was knocking down threes. He ain't played that much this whole season. And definitely didn't play that much in the postseason. But name was called. Ready to go. I'm sorry I've gotten off topic, but I've been talking a lot this week. I've had a lot to say about sports this week. About a lot of things. Because in my heart, it just hurts me so much that I want this generation to make me feel like my generation made me feel. 55 years old. I'm not cynical. I'm not stubborn. I'm trying. I watch. I listen. I try to give them a benefit of the doubt. And they just disappoint me with the things that they say. And I just wish they would take certain phrases and words out of today's sports vernacular. That's it. Define your own era. Keep it to your era. Leave my era alone. Leave the previous eras alone. They didn't have the opportunities that this era has in sports. Michael Jordan, and I'm going to go on again. Here we go. And there's another thing, too, about statistics that bother me. They say things like, this guy is all-time leading scorer for most points in a quarter or most game-winning shots, something like that. Let's say most game-winning shots. And you say to yourself, it's a good stat and it's a bad stat. It's a good stat because that means that you're clutch. It's a bad stat because your team is always in a position where you have to hit a shot to win. And I think about dominance. I think about like they used to have statistics. They talk about John Elway. And John Elway had the most fourth quarter wins and this, that, and the other thing when he did. Or Dan Marino. And you're like, it's a good stat, but maybe the team shouldn't be there. They don't take Brady because the Patriots didn't have to come from behind. I don't say Aaron Rodgers because the Packers didn't have to come from behind because they were always winning. Joe Montana, I always just laugh at that. They were like, Elway is the man because he in the fourth quarter, 2 minutes to go, you want him to have the ball and he's the all-time leader, come from behind, win. And I'd be like, well, that's a good stat and a bad stat. Bad stat because that means they're always losing. It's a good stat that means that he's tough and resilient and so on and so forth. But if you're not losing and you don't need to come from behind, why do I care if that guy always comes from behind? Well, my guy is always winning. And then, of course, Elway and Montana met and won Super Bowl. And the ass kicking commenced as the Niners won 55-10. Make it relevant, people. Then I'll shut up. But until you do, I'm going to say something about it.